Welcome to Contemporary Classics, a show featuring concert music exclusively by 20th and 21st century composers. I'm your host, Dave Lake. Some of this music will be by composers whose names may be unfamiliar to you, and some of the music will be by much more recognizable names in contemporary composition. Some of the music may shock you, but I think many of you will be surprised to find out how much music by contemporary composers is immensely enjoyable. The whole purpose of this show is to demonstrate the wide variety of contemporary classical music that is available and to bring my joy of contemporary classical music listening to you. As always, our opening theme music is from the work Nocturne by Kirsten Vollnis. Tonight on Contemporary Classics, we are featuring an interview with and the music of Oregon composer Christopher M. Wicks. We're going to begin by playing his Violin Sonata No. 6, Opus 636. The Violin Sonata No. 6 is played by violinist Stephanie Barth and pianist Deborah Huddleston. This piece continues the composer's explorations of classical sonata formal designs juxtaposed with the less predictable harmonic, melodic, and rhythmic language. The work is in 3 movements. The first movement is marked Moderato con moto, which uses traditional sonata allegro formal design. The second movement, marked Molto largo, is a song of mourning. The third, marked Allegretto, is something of an exercise for lyrical, multiple-stop playing by the violinist, while the changing added note chords of the piano takes on the character of a bell peal. Stephanie Barth, the violinist, is a concertmaster of the Salem Philharmonia and maintains an active strings studio. She has been responsible for the strings program at the Blanchette Catholic School and at the Seventh-day Adventist School in Salem. Deborah Huddleston, pianist, holds a Master of Music from the Hart School in Connecticut and studied at the Mozarteum in Salzburg, Austria. She is one of Salem's most sought-after keyboard accompanists and directs music at the First Presbyterian Church in Woodburn. This is a live performance by violinist Stephanie Barth and pianist Deborah Huddleston at the Mount Angel Abbey Library Auditorium on February 10th, 2018, and this was part of the program where the opera Love is Strong as Death was premiered. That was Christopher Wicks' Violin Sonata No. 6, as performed by violinist Stephanie Barth and pianist Deborah Huddleston from a live performance at Mount Angel Abbey Library Auditorium on February 10, 2018. Next, we have a performance of Christopher Wicks' Four Miniatures for Flute, as performed by Emily Potter. In Four Miniatures for Flute, the movements are very concise, and each represents a season of the year, beginning with the winter. It explores the seasons with a variety of tonal and semitonal compositional techniques. The subtitles of the movements are Icicles, Streamlets, Ripe Wheat, and Wind in the Dry Leaves. Emily Potter began her career in music while studying with Sandy Duffy Norman at the Sunridge Flute Studios in Salem, Oregon. She graduated from Boston University with a Bachelor of Music degree in flute performance and a Master of Music degree from the Guildhall School of Music and Drama in London. She has also performed with the Guildhall Opera Orchestra at the Barbican and the Guildhall Symphony Orchestra. She is a Miyazawa flute artist. Here is a performance of Four Miniatures for Flute, as performed by Emily Potter. You've been listening to a performance of Four Miniatures by Christopher Wicks as performed by Emily Potter Flute. This is WRUU-LP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.
WRUU brings you the most diverse and passionate local radio programming on the air in Savannah. This all-volunteer and nonprofit community radio station accepts no money from any form of government. Our diversity and independence is made possible only through the generous financial support of listeners like you. We rely on your annual and ongoing monthly contributions to cover the many costs associated with bringing you our broadcast and web programming. If you are a contributor, thank you. If you're not yet a contributor, please show your appreciation of the role WRUU plays in your life by becoming a contributor in any amount. You can donate quickly and easily by credit card or check. Just find the donate and subscribe links at WRUU.org. Thanks for listening to and supporting WRUU.
The Savannah National Wildlife Refuge protects more than 29,000 acres of freshwater marshes, tidal rivers and creeks, and bottomland hardwoods along the Savannah River, supporting a diverse array of migratory and resident wildlife. Visitor activities include a scenic wildlife drive, biking and hiking trails, and a free series of monthly speakers covering conservation and historical topics on the second Saturday of each month. For more information, visit fws.gov/Savannah.
Are you ready to become One Human Nation? Tune in to the One Human Nation show on Thursdays at 5 p.m. to listen and learn about race and racism in a safe, honest, open, and productive environment. You are invited to share your stories on the One Human Nation show Thursdays at 5 p.m. on 107.5 FM WRUU.
Tonight on Composers Conversations on Contemporary Classics, we have the Oregon composer, organist, and poet, Christopher M. Wicks. Welcome, Christopher Wicks.
Thank you, Dave.
Let's start by talking a little bit about your background. How did you become a composer?
I think that we compose because we have to, we compose because we need to, and we become composers through composing. I can't remember a time when I wasn't fascinated with the idea of composing music. I began insisting on playing the piano, somewhat at least, when I was about 3 years old. I began lessons at the piano when I was 5. And at a very young age, I began making sketches where I would put musical symbols on pieces of paper. I'd draw my own staves and then put musical symbols on them. I wasn't really musically literate enough at that point for the symbols to make any sense. They weren't really musical compositions, but I had this urge somehow to express myself in that way, and I would give them to my mother, who had had some piano lessons when she was younger. And I'd be very surprised that she couldn't play what I had given her. But in fact, what I was giving her didn't make any sense at all. It was just these hodgepodge of musical symbols. But then after I began taking lessons myself, I think when I was about 8 or 9 years old, I began to produce some musically literate compositions, little piano pieces that I could play for folks and so forth. I remember, I think it was when I was 9, I composed a little dance suite of 8 or 9 movements or so that started winning competitions in the area through the Oregon Music Teachers Association. Then won 3rd prize in a regional competition for the Western United States for students of about my age. Ever since then, composing has really been a center of my life. I have an undergraduate degree in it. I studied it at the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York, I didn't finish my undergraduate degree there. I did leave and came back to this area where I finished my bachelor's degree at Marylhurst College, now Marylhurst University up near Portland, where I studied with the composer Sister Anne Cecile Daigle of the Sisters of the Holy Names of Jesus and Mary. And then I earned a master's degree in composition from the Université de Montréal, the University of Montreal, one of the Francophone universities in Montreal. Also am a fellow of the American Guild of Organists, which is the highest certification given through the American Guild of Organists, and that has a composition component as well. So it's very difficult to say. I think that a true composer is sort of addicted to composing. It's something that is so much a part of us that we cannot get away from us. One can say that we can't be happy without composing, but I would go a step further and say we really can't be ourselves without composing.
And you are an organist as well.
I am an organist, yes. I began playing the organ when I was 12. I had been playing the piano my entire life, more or less. But the church which I attended at the time, well, it's actually my home church, I still formally belong to it, needed an organist, and somebody said, well, gee, Christopher can play the piano, maybe Christopher could play the organ for us too. I looked at the organ and I saw all these moving parts that it has, like that pedal board that you play with your feet, and all of those stops and all of those bells and whistles, and I thought, well, I'm not sure I can do that. But they had me take some lessons, and they offered me some money, which sweetened the deal a lot, and I've been playing the organ ever since then, too. So the organ was my primary instrument all through my compositional studies as an undergraduate, and I've been giving organ recitals since I was about 13 or 14. Then I earned a master's degree in organ performance at the University of Oregon. The organ is a great instrument, I think, for a composer to study and to know. While the keyboard instruments in general are terrific for understanding theory, the organ is perhaps the ne plus ultra of that, because there's a factor of Baroque improvisation, which is more pertinent with the organ than it is for many pianists. It requires keeping one's theory skills in good condition to be able to do Baroque improvisation, to read figured bass, and so forth. Also, organists learn something, I think, naturally about how to orchestrate, about the different sounds that different instruments can make, what with having all of those different timbres and textures at one's disposal, all of the different stops and so forth that an organ has.
Does that really help you in the composition? Does that help you in the theory? How does that help?
The organ specifically, as opposed to the piano, you mean?
Yeah.
It's hard to say exactly how it helps me now. I remember it helped me when I was first beginning to explore less tonal textures, sort of more modernist textures and harmonies. I used to need to compose by sitting at the organ and trying out every single sonority with my hands and feet before I wrote it down. And I liked, it was useful for me in those days, the way that the organ would sustain pitch in the way that the piano doesn't. So that if I held down two notes simultaneously and changed one of them while leaving another one the same, I would have that good sustained pitch with both tones that I could use to perceive directly exactly what effect I was getting. Now, when I compose, I usually compose sitting at a desk or at my computer, and I compose much more quickly, and I can hear in my head exactly what effect it is that I'm achieving when I make the marks on the page or on my computer screen. So that particular aspect of it isn't necessary anymore, but it was very helpful at one time. I remember what a painstaking process composing was for me when I was, say, 14 and 15 years old and first deciding that I wanted to explore some less tonal textures, do things that were more innovative. And sitting at the organ with my 5 fingers and my 2 feet and the ability to sustain pitch and the ability to hear all of those different timbres from the stops on the organ, I found it very helpful. It was an interesting way of exploring what I think it was the French composer Pierre Boulez who came up with the phrase le domaine musical, the musical domain.
You're quite prolific in terms of the range of instrumentation that you've written for. And also, you have numerous performances of your works in and around, I know, the Salem area, as well as some areas outside of Oregon. Do you pay the bills with composing?
No, I'm afraid that I don't. I wish that I did. My bread and butter is more the church music that I engage in. That's the most dependable of my sources of income. Working as a church organist and a church choral accompanist. Above and beyond that, there's a certain amount of income that I would say is more freelance income, that is from accompanying and from, say, selling poetry books, royalties for compositions, and so forth.
How did you get interested in doing poetry as well as music?
Oh, well, that is an interesting question. Now, poetry is a strangely unpopular pursuit, it seems, in our country these days. I remember as a small child not either liking it or disliking it all that much. But then I remember when I was about 12, sitting in my junior high school library, idly, I think it was, some lunch period or something, and I took down a volume from the shelf that said Poems Selected for Young People by Edna St. Vincent Millay. And I'd never heard of Edna St. Vincent Millay before, but I started reading. And I remember adoring her brief poems that were her young person poems. I remember trying to read Renaissance, her big breakthrough poem from when she was 19. All I could see from where I stood was 3 long mountains and a wood. And I thought it was beautiful, and I liked it, but it was so long, and it was so mysterious. But I knew then that whatever this thing is called poetry, and no one has ever really succeeded in defining it either, it was going to be something big in my life, and it and I were going to be together for a good long time. I think I started writing some poetry, or trying to, when I was an undergraduate, and then I've just sort of kept plugging away at it. We have a poetry association in our little town that puts on an annual festival, and I volunteered on that festival's board for 8 years, I think it was, from 2003 to 2010, and was the vice president at one point, and actually did a fair amount of volunteer work putting together a festival with presenters from all around the Pacific Northwest, whom we would find through a review process. So we have a fairly thriving scene for that in this area, and I guess I have a certain role in it.
Tonight on Composers Conversations, we have Christopher Wicks. It also seems that you work quite closely with some of the faculty and students as well at Western Oregon University.
I do seem to have fallen into a place where I have several collaborators who are at Western. That's been more as a matter of chance as far as I can tell. There are a lot of musicians in this area. We're fairly rich and fairly blessed in terms of musical opportunities. I guess Katherine Couch Parks is a cellist who's on the faculty there, and Marjorie Lang, violinist, although she's on the English faculty, not the music faculty. That's actually not a formal affiliation of mine, but it just seems to be the way that the cookie has crumbled. Many musicians I've found who are teachers and very active as performers in this area have adjunct teaching positions at maybe several schools, and Western Oregon University is just one of those.
As I mentioned before, you have quite a few performances around the area. How do you go about setting those up?
In this area, I like to have one new musical program a month in which I am involved in some significant way. And I have a lot of contact with churches, for example, and I have a lot of contacts with other performance spaces that are less directly affiliated with the church, but that are still sympathetic to me and to what it is that I'm trying to accomplish. I guess if you keep sort of plugging away doing the same thing in the same area long enough and doing it with a certain threshold of respectability, you develop a reputation after a while, and I guess folks figure that they can let me give a program in their hall and they know that something pretty good is going to happen, something that they won't be embarrassed about. And with collaborators, I just keep asking around until somebody says yes, and it's become easier and easier for people to say yes and for people to want to take part in the kind of thing that I'm doing. Now, with the opera, which we're especially going to talk about today, the opera was such a big time commitment and lots of work from the various people involved. And I did get the hall for free, actually, the auditorium in the library at the Mount Angel Abbey, a nearby Benedictine monastery. I have something of an informal but nonetheless fairly substantial relationship with that monastery that's gone back for quite some time, in terms of my giving an organ recital in their church every Advent, every December for several years, and sharing the proceeds with them. And so the folks at the library auditorium were very willing to let me do a run of performances for my opera without any kind of charge or any kind of red tape or any kind of difficulty. So, to find my collaborators, the singers and the pianist and the violinist who played the opening act, so to speak, for the opera, I did smash my piggy bank a little. I saved up for it, and I paid them substantial stipends. And that was worth it for me, because the opera was a real bucket list item. I've been involved with opera since a very young age. I sang in the chorus of the Portland Opera Company. I sang in 7 productions with them, some Verdi and some Puccini, and also Richard Strauss's Der Rosenkavalier. And I sang a few bit parts with them, the Bloody Child in Verdi's Macbeth, for example, and also Fyodor the Tsarevich in Mussorgsky's Boris Godunov. And my master's thesis, which I composed at the University of Montreal, was an opera based on Sophocles' tragedy Antigone, although I've never had the chance to have that work performed. After composing so many pieces that were sort of these pipe dreams that I had hoped to bring to the stage in some enormous way that would make my reputation and my fame and fortune, so forth, after all these years I decided that I needed to compose an opera that would actually be more pragmatically performable on a smaller scale. Said it was something that I needed to check off my list that I really needed to do in this life. So I decided that now was the time, and I splurged on paying what collaborators I needed to do this admittedly rather small-scale operatic project, but a full opera nonetheless. And at this point, I'm certainly not regretting having done that at all.
Sort of on a scale of rejection at one end, acceptance in the middle, and unbounded enthusiasm at the other end of the scale, where does the interest in contemporary classical music in your area of Oregon fall, both for the musicians as well as for the audience?
That's a very interesting question. And I'd say that we're somewhere between acceptance and unbridled enthusiasm. And it's hard to say exactly where that is. Of course, it depends on individual people to a large extent. Portland is only about an hour to the north. Portland feels like a different place. Portland is much more urbane and much more sophisticated, and there's this very mobile population in Portland that has a lot of concern with what is hip. There are a lot of hipsters in Portland. Salem and Silverton, which is where I live, is much closer to Salem. Salem does not so much have that ambiance to it. But in Salem, I understand that the public school music programs are really first-rate, and they impart an enormous sense of discipline to the young people, and a lot of knowledge of repertory, and a lot of technical skill. And folks who are veterans of these programs, by the time they graduate from them, have at the very least a certain respect and appreciation for serious experimentation in music, it seems to me. It might not be what they prefer most of all. Maybe when they go to a concert, what they really would like to hear, if they're minded to go to classical concerts, their first choice of what to hear might be Beethoven or Brahms, and that's great. Beethoven and Brahms are really wonderful, but I find there's certainly at least some openness to newer music as well. I don't find that there's any kind of sort of knee-jerk, know-nothing, anti-intellectual kind of contempt for that kind of music. That said, I will mention that in comparison to Rochester, New York, where I was a student at Easton for a while, or in comparison to Montreal, when folks hear a new piece of music, or the performers are being exposed to a new piece of music and trying to assimilate it, trying to incorporate its language, trying to make it convincing, I think that perhaps back in the Northeast there was a little bit more openness to music that went a little bit further out onto that experimental limb. We haven't got a knee-jerk prejudice against it here, but neither do we have quite so much willingness to go quite so far, to work quite so hard, to make something that is maybe in an unfamiliar language or that demands some unfamiliar techniques work just the same.
I think you fit in very well with that because you have some interesting techniques in your work, but it is easy to appreciate orally and to follow the music structurally. It's quite understandable. So do you think that some of the success that you've had is related to that?
Exactly. I think you've hit the nail right on the head. When I first came back from New York and Montreal, I was composing in a more experimental way, and I was composing in a way that demanded a very high level of technique and a tremendous amount of practice and focus on the pieces that I was writing to make them work in performance. I found myself learning through working with musicians in this area that really wasn't what they wanted, and that wasn't going to work so well. I think I learned that if I was going to enjoy making music in this social context, you can sit in your hermitage, as it were, as a composer, and have your inspiration come from somewhere very ineffable. But if you want it to be something that's performed by other human beings who have thoughts of their own and put before an audience who are individual people who are coming from a certain space, if you want to make it a social fact, exactly a question of compromise, I wouldn't say. Compromise is not the most pleasant word. But I wanted to be able to function as a composer within the society that exists here. And I found that I needed to... Sister Magdalene Fouch, a composer with whom I studied for a brief while at Marylhurst after returning from Montreal, she used to say that I needed to pull in my horns a little bit. And I think over a certain period of time I learned how to do that, and that I'm getting by pretty well based on that recommendation and the steps that I needed to take as a result.
That's a wonderful metaphor. One can be a little devilish in the complexity, both for the audience and the performers, but one must bring in one's horns a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Tonight on Composers Conversations, we have Christopher Wicks. Now, when you're working with musicians, how do you reach that compromise? Is that compromise something that you've done before you present the music to the musician? Or is that something that sort of develops as you're working with the musician before performance?
Nowadays, I've reached a place where I know performers, and I know my performers here, and I feel as though, say 90-95% of the time, I can do the work that's needed to make the music what it needs to be for them to play it before I actually see them. I can put the music in front of them in such a form that they can play it and will be able to not only hit the notes but make it musical, and will enjoy what they're doing and feel as though it's bringing out of them something that they want to have brought out of them as musicians. Now, there are exceptions to that. Every now and then, for example, when I'm composing string music, I'll compose a triple stop, a chord that is involving 3 of the 4 strings that are on a violin or a cello. The fingering required is such that some very good string player might say, for example, this just really isn't cello music. You're asking me to do something with my cello that the cello just really doesn't want to do. But I've gotten better and better, especially I think probably just in the last 10 years, of really working with musicians more and more at making sure that what I ask a cello to do is something not only that a cello theoretically can do, but that a cello actually can do, that a cellist likes to do, that a cellist wants to do, that a cellist finds musical and that really feels right for the cellist. And I think when you can set it up so that as many variables as possible you can control in such a way that composer, performer, listener, sort of that triangle, everybody is having a good time, to put it in very banal terms. Everybody is feeling heard and as though their preferences are being listened to. Then it makes for a better experience for everyone. And there are all these factors that you can't control involving the listener's tastes, what kind of a day the listener is having. If the listener is coming to your concert after just going out for a meal, was it a good meal or a bad meal? Maybe they're in a bad mood or a good mood because of that. But you can control the energy that's happening in the music, and a lot of that has to do with whether, say, if you're writing for the cello, as I was just saying, whether what you're asking the cellist to do with her cello is something that the cellist likes to do, that feels right. And I feel as though I've learned a lot in recent years about composing for instruments idiomatically and respecting the physical nature and the physical limitations of all of the major instruments, because they're physical artifacts. Respecting all of that in the way that I compose for them, instead of just, say, having my composition be some mathematical expose that's insensitive to what musicians really want to or can do, and is expecting them to conform to these pipe dreams of mine, whether it has any bearing on what their instruments really want to do or not.
It's really interesting sometimes in your comment about how you approach the concert, what your experience was. Did you have a good meal? Are you having a good day? Sometimes I'd like to go to concerts twice and have the same concert twice. Just as I love to listen to recorded music because of the fact that it gives me an opportunity to re-expose myself under different circumstances to the same piece. I find that much more consuming in my way, that I can get a better hold on what I'm listening to. And I'm not going by immediate reactions, but rather I'm going by a more thoughtful reaction. Do you speak to the audience at the beginning or during your performances?
Well, that depends on the setting, but I often do, yes. Now, it's very interesting that you should bring that up. The opera, which I premiered on February 3rd, February 10th, we did a run of 2 performances for this. And at the first performance, I stood up beforehand and gave some very perfunctory notices asking folks to turn their cell phones off and so forth. But then I said, no, I have a program note that I've given you that more or less explains what's going on with this piece. And then on the back of your program, you'll find bios of the performers and of myself and so forth. And I said, so you probably don't need to hear me say anything else. I could give a real lecture. I could go on and on about this piece. But you didn't come for that. You came to hear music, so I'll just be quiet now and sit down. That was what I chose to do. And then, much to my surprise, the only negative feedback that I had about that performance was that people wanted to hear me talk more, that they wanted to hear more of what I had to say about this piece of mine that was being premiered. And I think of myself as something of a voluble fellow, so it surprised me that someone actually wanted to hear me talk more about something. But for the second performance, I stood up and talked for about 10 minutes about the violin sonatas which were opening the show, and then about the opera itself, and about how I saw it as fitting into the history of opera in general, and about what influence there might be of Wagner, for example, because 2 of the characters in my opera have names derived from the same Celtic folk legend from which Wagner derived inspiration for one of his librettos. I found that I had quite a lot to say. I hope I didn't talk for too long, but at the end of that, there was actually a fair amount of positive feedback, especially from a few people who had been there both weeks. They thought that it was a very good idea that I had taken advantage of that opportunity to say what I had to say. And I had thought that I had put as much as really needed to be heard into my written program note. But either I had not actually done so, or else there was something about hearing it delivered in a more extemporaneous way, orally rather than on the written page, that was very helpful for some people.
People often don't read those notes. They're in conversation and other things before the concert begins. So,
I try not to have mine be too dry. I was thinking that something I've noticed that new music programming notes often do is, toward the very beginning, they start going off into all of this numerical, number-based music theory jargon that you really can't expect the lay audience member to understand. And I don't blame them for not reading that. I mean, how can they be expected to devote lots of pre-concert attention to something that they know they're not going to understand? But my program note, I thought, was more sort of literary in tone, so I thought it would be more engaging. But maybe they hadn't read it.
You don't speak to each work necessarily between works.
Well, that time I didn't. I guess I have at times, and at other times, no. It's sort of a judgment call, I would say.
In our area, there's a great need for pre-concert or pre-work discussion, particularly of works that are a little bit more challenging, more orally challenging, to help the audience along the way, because I'm not even sure in our area we're approaching acceptance yet.
Mm-hmm.
So you may have very different audiences that come looking for novelty, come looking for new, and are actively seeking that. Frankly, in our area, you almost have to give an apology.
If it makes you feel any better, I think I seem to remember hearing about maybe 20, 25 years ago in this area, pre-concert talks that addressed new pieces had to have that tone also. Or I don't know whether they had to, but I remember hearing that tone, the apologetic tone, as though they're saying, this music is better than it sounds, something like that. You're not going to enjoy what you're about to hear, but somehow it will do you good. It's like eating your Brussels sprouts or something like that. In more recent years, I think the tenor of things has changed. The level of understanding of and connection with somewhat more experimental modes of expression, it's really increased. So these things change if the people who really value these things, if they keep trying. Persistence is rewarded.
Because even at Spoleto, and that's up in Charleston, South Carolina, which is some distance from here, I almost recognize everybody at the Music and Time concerts because of the fact that many of the same people come to those Music and Time concerts, of which there are generally 3 or 4, because they really appreciate and really are interested. Then you see other folks who come. I always try to look at them before they leave to see what their reaction is, because often they're there uninformed, and so they're really surprised about what's going on. In the Music and Time, I have to admit, it's really cutting edge. It is really cutting edge. And you have to have a high tolerance to really, I think, appreciate those. Elsewhere, they have 20th and 21st century music that's much more orally acceptable, that are presented in larger formats. I am pleased to see large turnouts and positive reactions to those. I hope you've been enjoying this conversation with Christopher M. Wicks. Next hour, you'll be listening to a discussion of his opera, Love is Strong as Death, and a complete performance of the half-hour opera, as was performed at the Mount Angel Abbey Library Auditorium on February 10th, 2018, and featured Aimee Amend as Isolde, Bennett Bailey as Tristram, Alison Seeber as the Angel, and Deborah Huddleston, pianist. By the way, this performance will be repeated on Sunday, May 27th, 2018, at 3 p.m. at the Emmanuel Presbyterian Church at 19200 Willamette Drive in Westland, Oregon, with the same cast of Alison Seeber, Aimee Amend, and Bennett Bailey, but this time with composer Christopher Wicks at the piano. This is WRUU-LP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. Tonight on Composers Conversations on Contemporary Classics, we have the Oregon composer, organist, and poet, Christopher Wicks. So let's talk a little bit more about Love is Strong as Death, your opera. It's based on the Celtic folk tale of Tristram and Isolde, and it involves both of those individuals as characters as well as an angel.
Yes, I feel as though I should mention that what it has to do with Tristram and Isolde is that there are two lovers, of course, with those names. I named the two lovers in my libretto with those two names so as to call attention to their archetypal aspects. I don't go into the backstory about Isolde being taken by King Mark as war booty from Ireland to Cornwall and about the adultery and so forth. My libretto actually begins after Tristram's death, which is about midway through Act 3, the final act of Wagner's opera, where that happens. So, my opera is a kind of sequel to Wagner. Love is Strong as Death. I take those names from Celtic legend as a basis, and then I also incorporate direct quotes from the text, although not the music, of an ancient English ballad called The Unquiet Grave. I quote its words, but I come up with my own melody for it. And The Unquiet Grave has to do with a woman who is very grief-stricken by the death of her lover, as Isolde was grief-stricken by the death of Tristram, and she's keeping a vigil at his tomb. She actually stays there, it says, in the ballad for a full year and a day, hoping for one more kiss of her beloved. And exactly how she imagines that this is going to happen isn't clear. I guess you could say that she's gone mad from grief. But then we come to understand that her excessive grief is disturbing the repose of the dead man whom she loves. And the angel is this third character whom I interpolate into the story. And the angel begins by attempting to persuade Isolde to abandon her grief and go back to the land of the living. And the angel speaks almost entirely in scriptural quotes in my libretto. The only exceptions are a couple of places where she sings, "Arise, Isolde, arise," or sort of these vocative addresses to Isolde. But other than that, the angel sings quotes from the Gospel of Matthew and the prophet Isaiah, and mostly the Song of Solomon, actually, talking about love and about life and about turning away from an obsession with death and trying to embrace life instead. And it might be implied at the beginning that what the angel is hoping to convince Isolde to do is to cease grieving and cease thinking about Tristram altogether. But Isolde is very persistent in my libretto. The libretto is sort of a collage. The music doesn't contain any quotation. The music is all originally mine. But the libretto is a collage, what with the biblical quotes, the quotes from the English folk ballad The Unquiet Grave, and then 3 sonnets and 3 villanelles, which are sung by Tristram and by Isolde. And those were written by me, the sonnets and the villanelles. But I had written them actually before I started putting the libretto together. And what I did is I looked through my files at these hundreds of sonnets and dozens of villanelles that I've written and found ones that worked in this context and just adapted them a little bit to make a story out of them. And the sonnet, as is fairly well known, those are 14 lines of iambic pentameter with a Shakespearean or a Petrarchan rhyme scheme. And those are the poems which Tristram sings. The villanelle is a slightly less well-known poetic fixed form. It's of French origin, and villanelles are in 19 lines, and they have a certain prescribed pattern of repetition of complete lines, or at least the final words of lines, as the poem goes along. they're built on only 2 rhyming words, so they have a very tight rhyme scheme. I find it an interesting challenge to write a villanelle. Isolde has 3 arias throughout the opera, and which is about a half hour long in all, and each of her arias sets a villanelle which I wrote. There's a large-scale symmetry in the structure of the opera. It's in 12 vignettes. It opens and closes with trios in which all of the 3 characters sing. And then between then we have the second and the next to last vignettes are both Isolde's arias. And the one in the middle is an aria by Isolde also. And then between those are arias by Tristan after Isolde's first aria and before Isolde's last aria. And then in between each of these utterances by Isolde and Tristan is a brief arietta, I might call it, in which the angel sings in quotes from the Song of Solomon. If that's all clear as mud, I could draw you a diagram which would make it all much clearer, but if you just understand that there's a symmetry to it, that should give you a fair idea of what's going on. And the big dramatic sort of trajectory of the story is that, it's somewhat indefinable and somewhat mystical. But basically, Isolde's persistence is such that at the end she does attain a state of life, and so does Tristan, but they attain it together. Rather than Isolde, in order to return to life, having to turn away from her grief and forget about Tristan, she is reunited with Tristan in a place that's beyond dichotomies of life and death, beyond time, beyond the dichotomies of flourishing or suffering. And the 3 of them, in the very final vignette, join in singing Love is Strong as Death, which is the title of the piece, of course, a quote from the Song of Solomon. The angel sings that over and over in the final vignette, while Isolde sings, Make haste, my beloved, and be like a young stag on the mountains of spices, and another quote from the Song of Solomon. And Tristan sings, Rise up, my fair one, and come away. Behold, the time of singing is come. Behold, the spring is with us again. I'm paraphrasing a little quotes from the Song of Solomon. The point is that through Isolde's persistence and through Tristan's reciprocal love of her and through the angel's understanding of this and intervention, they reach this ecstatic state of union together in the next world.
Draws me with force like a desire. Still to restore you to my heart. Did not know better than to sell. largest, well it might be so. Was your claim cast upon the richest ground, the deepest or the oldest? Can I know? Was your terrain the firmest? Or the sound? What makes you first and foremost in my love? What makes your place within my heart unique? Even in the grave, I raise my glance above. I see forever and find what I seek. Only you can cause my weary eye to see the heaven beyond the ocean sky.
Coming on
I'm very surprised to hear that the poetry was actually written a while back and you searched through that to incorporate into this work, because it seems to fit wonderfully, particularly with the biblical quotes and then the rare quote from the ancient folk ballad, The Unquiet Grave. I'm astounded that it fits so well.
As I mentioned, I've written dozens of villanelles. That isn't as many, so with the villanelles it was a little bit more of a challenge making them fit. I have written literally hundreds of sonnets by this point. I think just the other day I wrote sonnet 457, and I've actually published a book of my first 365 sonnets, a yearbook of sonnets, one for each day of the year. So I had a lot to choose from when it came to those sonnets, and I think I wouldn't have chosen this dramatic material for an opera if I weren't very much engaged with it in my own life as a poet. So I think probably because of that, when I started looking through my hundreds of sonnets trying to find ones that would suit this story, it was almost harder to choose which ones to leave out than it was to choose which ones to include.
And the incorporation of the Song of Solomon, too, is just spectacular in terms of the angel.
Yes, the angel's words in all of those arietas come from the Song of Solomon. Mm-hmm. It's such an amazingly evocative and rich passage from the scripture, and that seems almost like a ridiculous thing to say because, of course, the scriptures are very, very evocative and rich in so many ways. I think it's a book that, it's a passage that is very, very human in a way that is sometimes under-recognized. The words that are sung in the first vignette by Tristan and Isolde come from the English folk ballad, and the words that are sung by Tristan and Isolde in the last vignette come from the Song of Solomon. But other than that, the words that are sung by Tristan and Isolde come from my original poetry. We've talked a little bit about cultural contrast, perhaps, between your area and mine, and one thing about Oregon is that it's famous for having large groups of people who consider themselves, quote, spiritual but not religious, end quote. We have this very large delegation of people who consider themselves very openly and publicly hostile to formal Christian observance. I hear a lot about this, especially up in the Portland area. It's very chic to know nothing about Christian scripture or to reject it as openly as possible. So I find that with a book such as the Song of Solomon, and I believe it's the only book of the Bible that doesn't explicitly mention the name of God, although I do use quotes from Isaiah and from Matthew, which do mention God earlier on, or at least quotes from those books, and those books do mention God in more explicit ways. The Song of Solomon has this kind of earthiness, this kind of humanity to it that I understand has made some persons wonder before what it's even doing in the scriptural canon. We look at it sometimes and we think it's so erotic. What does this have to do with what comes right before it and with what comes right after it? Is this even decent? I've heard it questioned at times. I think that in the mouth of the angel in the context of this piece, it becomes clearer what it's really about, that it's about love and the essence of love and how all-transcendent that is and can be. And I think that that can win over the hearts of persons even who think when they hear the word God, words that are so strongly associated with Scripture, they think that what's going to come next is some sort of tedious or condemning sermon. That's their prejudice, is to assume that. But texts such as the Song of Solomon can be a way of introducing the loving nature of God and a kind of direct experience of it. Especially with music, the best music I could produce as a kind of emissary, as a kind of solvent to get that message across.
And it seems more like spiritual poetry and less like scripture.
I think according to many persons' stereotype of what Scripture is, or what they expect Scripture to be, it does seem more like spiritual poetry than like Scripture. But the simple fact is that it is Scripture. It's been seen as canonical Judeo-Christian Scripture for eons.
Mm-hmm.
I have to thank my performers, my collaborators, from the bottom of my heart, if I haven't done so yet. I was just amazed yet not surprised, because I know them and I know what they can do by their engagement with the piece, not only on the technical musical level of learning their parts and delivering the correct notes and rhythms, but understanding the dramatic and poetic content of it. I would like to say that the particular place where the opera was premiered has a lot of special meaning for me, because there was something about presenting a piece that was about the intervening love of God and its power to take us to that place, as I said, beyond dichotomies of life and death, beyond dichotomies of suffering and flourishing, to be with our beloved ones. There was something about presenting a work that was about that kind of content at an auditorium at a monastery that was very special for me, especially a monastery that's called Mount Angel, where one of the characters is an angel. And I think that when a person grows up in this area, specifically Silverton, Mount Angel, Silverton is about 4 miles away from Mount Angel, and both of us about 15 miles away from Salem. That abbey, that monastery, is something that's always there for a person. It's a place of quiet and calm and consolation that is so holy and so infinitely available and so reliable. I remember, for example, a time when I was having a lot of difficulty as an undergraduate. I was home for a vacation, and I was feeling very unmoored in terms of my sense of purpose and so forth. And a friend of mine said to me, "Oh, we should go up to the Abbey." And I said, "Well, why should we do that? How pointless that would be. What good could possibly come from going to one place other than another?" And she said, "Oh, shut up, I'm taking you there." And so we went up there, and there it was again, the mystery and the beauty of the place. And I had really had an experience that had changed my frame of mind by the time that I left. So it meant a lot to me that if I was going to compose an opera about a spiritual subject such as this, and choose a place in all the world, really, to put it before the public for the first time, that I was able to put it before the public for the first time in a place of grace such as that. That was a huge gift to me then, that I was allowed to do that.
Now, just to help me understand, the auditorium, is it, as it sounds, a strict auditorium, or does it more reflect the characteristics of the Abbey itself?
It's in the library, not in the church. It's in really what's intended as the seminaries and monasteries library. So, strictly speaking, according to the church's paradigms, it's not a sanctified space. It's not a liturgical space. But this library was designed by Alvar Aalto, the prominent Finnish mid-20th century modern architect, and it's built on the side of the fairly tall butte that the Abbey is on. And it's just a beautiful, very refreshing modern building. And the auditorium seats about 120, I believe, and has a lovely resonant acoustic and a very nice 9-foot grand piano in it. And it's not in the same structure as the church, where the Liturgy of the Hours is prayed and where Mass is said and where the tabernacle is and the host and so forth. As I said, it's not, strictly speaking, according to the paradigms of the Catholic Church, a ritualistic, sacramental space. But for me, that library, just by virtue of its location on the hilltop and also by virtue of its aesthetic beauty, that's a kind of holiness of its own, of course.
So do you think that the location added to the spiritualism of the work?
Yes, I do think so. I think it helped to have it on the Holy Hill. I appreciated that a great deal, even at the same time that it isn't exactly in the Orthodox sense a devotional work, and for that reason we probably wouldn't have presented it in the church itself, in the chapel itself.
Anything else you'd like to say about this before we play it?
Well, I want to thank you for your interest in my work, and it means a great deal to me. And I will mention that I'm very interested in follow-up performances. We're going to have another performance of the piece the last weekend in May, on Sunday the 27th. And delightful though the violin music was with which we opened the premiere, I've gone through my files and found some excerpts from other dramatic, operatic works of mine. So what we plan to do is have about a half hour's worth of unstaged excerpts from those to introduce the opera this time, just to have a more consistent profile in terms of the genre of music being presented in the event.
And when is that event again?
Sunday the 27th, the last Sunday in May at 3 p.m.
Tonight we've had Christopher Wicks on Composer Conversations on Contemporary Classics, and I want to thank you very much for being a part of our show.
I think this is great what you're doing. Thank you, Dave.
The performance of Love is Strong as Death that you heard in this interview featured Aimee Amend as Isolde, Bennett Bailey as Tristram, and Alison Seeber as the Angel, with Deborah Huddleston, pianist. A little bit about the performers. Aimee Amend is a soprano who holds a Master of Music degree from Western Oregon University in Monmouth. She is a soprano section leader for the Willamette Master Chorus in Salem and the director of music for the Unitarian Universalist Congregation in Salem. Alison Seeber is extensively involved in the music at St. Paul's Catholic Church in Silverton and sings in an eclectic vocal group called Ad Lucium. She was a charter member of the chamber chorus Unistas and sang for several seasons with the Oregon Repertory Singers. Bennett Bailey is currently the music director of the Emmanuel Presbyterian Church, music director for Willamette Radio Workshop, founder and director of the Holly Jolly Radio Singers, founder and director of the Complaints Choir of Portland, staff singer and soloist for Cantores in Ecclesia, and former director of the Vivoice Women's Chorus, and creative director for Stream Radio Syndicate. Bennett holds a BA in music from Portland State University, where he was later a graduate teaching assistant. Love is Strong as Death will be repeated on Sunday, May 27th, 2018, at 3 p.m. at the Emmanuel Presbyterian Church at 19200 Willamette Drive in Westland, Oregon, with the same cast of Alison Seeber, Aimee Amend, and Bennett Bailey, but this time with composer Christopher Wicks at the piano. This is WRUU-LP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.
WRUU listeners like you crave exploration and discovery. That's how we can offer your business or organization a unique way to separate your name from the clutter inherent in commercial radio advertising. Underwriting on non-commercial WRUU will make your name stand out because we allow only a limited number of sponsorships per hour. And your message will be reaching listeners who are actively engaged in programs that demand their attention. Let our team build a customized plan to meet your marketing goals by linking your name to our unique music and talk programs. For more information, email underwriting@wruu.org. On Friday mornings at 11 a.m., please join me for my show called Beyond the Liner Notes. I'm your host, Brian Renner. Each week, I feature a different genre of music and provide some background information about artists and recordings. Tune in on Fridays at 11 for Beyond the Liner Notes.
The University of Georgia Marine Education Center and Aquarium is located in Savannah on Skidaway Island. Home to Georgia's first saltwater aquarium, it features 16 exhibit tanks that showcase a variety of Georgia's marine life. In addition to the aquarium, the facility hosts educational exhibits, public programs, summer camps, an ADA-compliant nature boardwalk, and special events. For more information, visit gacoast.uga.edu or call 912-598-2496.
We're going to end tonight's celebration of the music of Christopher Wicks with Christopher Wicks Cello Suite No. 3, Opus 546, as performed by Katherine Parks, cello. You've been listening to a performance of Christopher Wicks Cello Suite No. 3, Opus 546, as performed by Katherine Parks. Thank you for listening to Contemporary Classics tonight in our celebration of the music of Christopher Wicks. Next up, we have Eccentric Focus with Shane Martin.